It was a standoff that could have lasted forever, but it was broken by the sound of approaching horses. Through the window, Samuel could see riders surrounding the house, not Hartwell's men, but women, dozens of them, armed and determined. The Prairie Sisters had come to finish what Elizabeth had started. Martha Crenshaw led them, her gray hair streaming behind her like a battle flag. Behind her rode women from every walk of life, farmers' wives, saloon girls, school teachers, and widows, all united by their determination to see justice done. The moonlight caught the steel of their weapons, and their faces were set with the kind of resolve that comes from years of suffering in silence. Samuel recognized some of them from town. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's widow who had lost her husband to claim jumpers. Sarah Mitchell, the schoolteacher whose brother had disappeared after, refusing to sell his land. Even Mary O'Sullivan, one of the saloon girls who had helped countless women escape abusive situations. They had all been touched by the corruption that festered in Millfield, and now they had come to end it once and for all. "It's over, Thomas," Martha called from the yard, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades fighting for justice. "We have your records, your correspondence, everything Elizabeth gathered before you locked her away. The territorial marshal is on his way with federal warrants." Hartwell's face went white as fresh snow. "That's impossible. I destroyed everything." "Elizabeth was smarter than you gave her credit for," Samuel said, never taking his eyes off the older man. "She hid copies with the Prairie Sisters before you caught her. Insurance, you might say." The sound of more horses announced the arrival of the territorial marshal and his men. Marshal William Hayes was a legend in these parts, a man who had cleaned up 3 territories and wasn't afraid to take on corrupt officials, no matter how powerful they thought themselves. As they surrounded the house, Hartwell seemed to age 10 years in as many seconds. His empire was crumbling, and he knew it. But Thomas Hartwell was not a man to go quietly. With a snarl of rage, he lunged for a hidden gun in his desk drawer. Samuel's reflexes were faster, his bullet taking Hartwell in the shoulder and spinning him around. The older man collapsed behind his desk, clutching his wound and cursing. "It's over," Samuel said quietly. As the marshal's men secured Hartwell and began searching the house, Martha entered the study with several of the Prairie Sisters. In her hands was a leather satchel, bulging with documents. 23 years, she said, setting the satchel on Hartwell's desk. 23 years we've been documenting his crimes, waiting for the right moment to strike. Elizabeth gave us that moment. Samuel opened the satchel and whistled low. Inside were hundreds of documents, forged land deeds, correspondence between conspirators, detailed accounts of murders and disappearances, financial records showing bribes and payoffs. It was enough evidence to hang half the town's leadership. "How did you manage to gather all this?" Samuel asked. Martha smiled grimly. "You'd be surprised how invisible women can be, especially to men like Hartwell. We cleaned their houses, served their drinks, took care of their children. They talked around us like we weren't even there. Every conversation, every secret meeting, every dirty deal, we were listening." The marshal entered the study, his weathered face grim. "Mr. Cross, I understand you're the one who found Miss Hartwell?" "That's right, Marshal." "And you've been protecting her from Sheriff Donovan and his men?" Samuel nodded. "Donovan's part of this conspiracy. He knew Elizabeth was locked in that barn, and he was willing to let her die to protect Hartwell's secrets." Marshal Hayes turned to Martha. "Mrs. Crenshaw, I've heard stories about your organization. The Prairie Sisters, they call you? We prefer to think of ourselves as concerned citizens. Martha replied diplomatically. Well, these concerned citizens have just handed me the biggest corruption case I've seen in 30 years of law enforcement. I'll need statements from all of you, and I'll want to interview Miss Hartwell as soon as she's able. Over the next several hours, as dawn broke over Millfield, the full scope of the conspiracy began to unravel. Sheriff Donovan was arrested at his home, along with Mayor Caldwell and 6 members of the town council. The bank president tried to flee but was captured at the county line with a saddlebag full of stolen money. Even the newspaper editor was taken into custody, his printing press seized as evidence of his role in covering up the crimes. The Prairie Sisters worked alongside the marshal's men, their intimate knowledge of the conspiracy proving invaluable in tracking down evidence and identifying accomplices. Women who had been silent for years finally found their voices, coming forward with testimonies of abuse, intimidation, and murder. Mrs. Henderson told of how her husband had been beaten to death by claim jumpers after refusing to sell his bakery. Sarah Mitchell revealed that her brother hadn't died in an accident. He had been murdered after discovering forged documents in the land office. Mary O'Sullivan spoke of the women who had come to her for help, fleeing husbands who beat them and officials who ignored their pleas for protection. As the sun rose higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time since he'd found Elizabeth in that barn, he allowed himself to believe that justice might actually be served. The conspiracy that had terrorized Millfield for decades was finally being exposed, and the men responsible would face the consequences of their actions. But even as he watched Hartwell being loaded into a prison wagon, Samuel knew that the real work was just beginning. Elizabeth would need time to heal, both physically and emotionally. The town would need to rebuild its institutions from the ground up, and the Prairie Sisters would need to continue their vigilance, ensuring that such corruption could never take root again. The trials that followed would become legend in the territory. One by one, the conspirators fell. Sheriff Donovan, Mayor Caldwell, and a dozen others, all brought down by the evidence Elizabeth had so carefully gathered and the Prairie Sisters had so patiently preserved. The courtroom was packed every day, with people traveling from neighboring counties to witness justice finally being served. Elizabeth testified for 3 days, her voice growing stronger with each hour as she recounted the horrors she had endured and the crimes she had witnessed. The jury was visibly moved by her account of giving birth alone in that barn, of losing her child to cold and neglect, of lighting a candle every night for 3 years to honor his memory. The defense attorneys tried to discredit her testimony, claiming that 3 years of imprisonment had driven her insane, that her memories couldn't be trusted. But the physical evidence was overwhelming. The documents she had hidden with the Prairie Sisters, the testimony of other victims, the financial records that showed the flow of stolen money. Thomas Hartwell himself received a life sentence, though he would die in prison less than a year later. A broken man who had lost everything he had spent his life building. His vast holdings were seized by the territorial government and redistributed to the homesteaders who had been cheated out of their land. Sheriff Donovan was sentenced to 20 years for his role in the conspiracy. Mayor Caldwell received 15 years. The bank president, who had cooperated with investigators in exchange for a lighter sentence, was given 10 years and ordered to make full restitution to his victims. The Prairie Sisters emerged from the shadows, their network revealed as a force for justice that had been operating under everyone's noses for years. Martha Crenshaw was appointed to the new town council, along with several other women who had proven their dedication to honest governance. But for Samuel and Elizabeth, the end of the conspiracy was just the beginning. As the weeks passed and Elizabeth continued to heal, something grew between them, not just gratitude or shared trauma, but something deeper and more lasting. The healing process was not easy. Elizabeth suffered from nightmares, waking in the middle of the night screaming, convinced she was still chained in that barn. Samuel would hold her until the terror passed, speaking softly about the future they could build together, about the garden they would plant where the barn once stood. Doc Patterson worked tirelessly to restore Elizabeth's physical health. She had suffered from malnutrition, exposure, and the psychological trauma of her imprisonment. Her body bore scars that would never fully heal, marks from the chains, calluses from scratching the days into the barn wall, the deep lines of premature aging that came from 3 years of unimaginable suffering. But her spirit, Samuel discovered, was unbroken. As she regained her strength, Elizabeth threw herself into the work of rebuilding Millfield. She helped establish a new school, worked with the Prairie Sisters to create a sanctuary for abused women, and testified before the territorial legislature about the need for stronger laws protecting homesteaders' rights. The townspeople, initially suspicious of the woman who had brought down their leaders, gradually came to respect and admire Elizabeth's courage. They saw how she worked tirelessly to help others, how she never sought revenge against those who had ignored her suffering, how she focused on building a better future rather than dwelling on the past. Samuel found himself changing too. The isolation and bitterness that had defined his life for so many years began to fade, replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since before the war. He worked alongside Elizabeth and the Prairie Sisters, using his skills as a former lawman to help train women in self-defense and to investigate reports of abuse in neighboring communities. Their courtship was gentle and patient. Samuel understood that Elizabeth needed time to heal, to learn to trust again, to believe that she was truly free. They spent long hours talking about their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Samuel told her about his time as a lawman, about the war that had scarred his soul, about the family he had lost and the guilt that had driven him to the frontier. Elizabeth shared her memories of life before the barn, her work with the Prairie Sisters, her love affair with David Morrison, her growing awareness of her father's crimes. She spoke of the night she had been captured, how her father's men had come for her in the darkness, how she had fought and screamed, but no one had come to help her. "I thought I was going to die in that barn," she told him one night as they sat by the fire. "For the first year, I prayed for death. It seemed kinder than living like an animal." "What changed?" Samuel asked. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "The baby," she said finally. "When I realized I was pregnant, I knew I had to survive. Not for myself, but for him. I had to believe that someday someone would find us, that someone would care enough to look for the light." One evening, as they sat watching the sunset from the porch of Samuel's ranch, Elizabeth spoke the words that had been building between them for weeks. "I want to stay," she said simply, "here with you, if you'll have me." Samuel took her hand, feeling the calluses that had formed during her years of imprisonment, the scars that would never fully fade. "I've been alone for a long time," he said. "Thought I preferred it that way. And now?" He smiled, the first genuine smile he had worn in years. "Now I think maybe I was just waiting for the right person to share it with." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Samuel thought about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. a glimpse of light in the darkness, a decision to investigate rather than ride away, a choice to stand up for what was right, even when it meant standing alone. The barn still stood on the prairie, but it was no longer a place of horror. Elizabeth had returned there once with Samuel at her side to properly bury her child and say goodbye to the past. They had found the tiny grave she had dug with her own hands, marked only by a small pile of stones. Together, they had said prayers over the unmarked grave and planted wildflowers around the perimeter. Then they had torn down the walls that had held her prisoner and scattered the boards to the wind. Some of the wood they burned in a great bonfire that could be seen for miles across the prairie. The rest they gave to families in need, transforming the instruments of Elizabeth's torment into homes for those who had lost everything to Hartwell's greed. In its place, they had planted a garden, a small patch of green in the vast brown of the prairie, where wildflowers grew in memory of the innocent and hope bloomed eternal under the endless sky. Elizabeth tended the garden with the same devotion she had once shown to her nightly candle, nurturing life from the soil that had once held only death and despair. The loner cowman was alone no more, and the woman who had been locked away for 3 years was finally, truly free. Together they had faced the darkness and emerged into the light, proving that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is simply one person's decision to do what's right, no matter the cost. Samuel and Elizabeth were married the following spring, in a ceremony attended by the Prairie Sisters and presided over by a new judge, an honest man who understood the difference between law and justice. The wedding was held in the garden they had planted where the barn once stood, with wildflowers serving as decoration and the endless prairie sky as their cathedral ceiling. Martha Crenshaw gave Elizabeth away, standing in for the father who had betrayed her so completely. The old woman's eyes were bright with tears as she placed Elizabeth's hand in Samuel's, knowing that she was witnessing not just a wedding, but the triumph of love over hatred, of hope over despair. The reception was a community affair, with people coming from all over the territory to celebrate. Former homesteaders who had reclaimed their land brought food and music. The Prairie Sisters sang songs of freedom and justice. Even Marshal Hayes attended, bringing news that the territorial governor had officially commended Elizabeth and the Prairie Sisters for their role in exposing the corruption. Their first child was born 2 years later, a healthy boy they named David, in honor of the young lawyer whose death had started it all. Elizabeth wept when she held him for the first time, remembering the child she had lost in that terrible barn. But these were tears of joy rather than sorrow. The ranch prospered under their joint care, becoming not just a home, but a sanctuary for those who needed refuge from the harsh realities of frontier life. They took in orphans, sheltered abused women, and provided work for men who had lost everything to corrupt officials. The house that had once echoed with Samuel's loneliness now rang with the laughter of children and the voices of friends. The Prairie Sisters continued their work, now operating openly with the support of the territorial government, and their network grew to encompass the entire region. They established schools for girls, safe houses for women fleeing violence, and a system of communication that allowed isolated communities to call for help when needed. Elizabeth became their unofficial leader, her experience giving her a unique understanding of both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human courage. She traveled throughout the territory, speaking to women's groups, testifying before legislatures, and helping to establish new chapters of the Prairie Sisters in communities that needed them. Samuel supported her work completely, understanding that her mission was not just about helping others, but about healing herself. He often accompanied her on her travels, providing protection and moral support as she shared her story with audiences who were sometimes skeptical, sometimes hostile, but always ultimately moved by her courage. Years passed, and the garden where the barn had stood grew larger and more beautiful. Elizabeth added new sections each year: a rose garden for beauty, an herb garden for healing, a vegetable garden to feed the hungry souls who found their way to the ranch. Children played among the flowers, their laughter a stark contrast to the screams that had once echoed from that spot. The Prairie Sisters became a permanent fixture in the territory, their influence spreading far beyond Mill Field. They established the first women's college west of the Mississippi, created a network of safe houses that stretched from Canada to Mexico, and successfully lobbied for laws protecting women's property rights and children's welfare. Martha Crenshaw lived to see her 92nd birthday, spending her final years as the honored elder of the movement she had helped create. At her funeral, women came from across the continent to pay their respects, many of them carrying stories of how the Prairie Sisters had saved their lives or the lives of their daughters. Elizabeth spoke at the service, her voice strong and clear as she talked about the woman who had given her hope in her darkest hour. "Martha taught us that justice isn't something that happens to us," she said. "It's something we make happen, one act of courage at a time. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind was just right, Samuel would look out across the prairie and remember that night when he had seen a light in the darkness and chosen to investigate. It was a choice that had changed everything, not just for Elizabeth, but for an entire community that had learned the true meaning of justice and the power of standing together against corruption and cruelty. The light in the barn was gone, but its legacy lived on in the lives they had built together, in the children who played in the garden where the barn once stood, and in the knowledge that sometimes the smallest act of courage can illuminate the darkest corners of the world. As their family grew, they would eventually have 4 children together. Samuel and Elizabeth made sure to tell them the story of the light in the barn, not to frighten them, but to teach them about the importance of paying attention, of caring about others, of never walking away when someone needs help. "Your mother was the strongest person I ever knew," Samuel would tell them as they sat around the fire on winter evenings. "She survived 3 years in hell because she never gave up hope that someone would see her light and come to help her. And your father," Elizabeth would add, "was brave enough to investigate when he could have just ridden away. He chose to care about a stranger, and that choice saved my life." The children would listen with wide eyes, trying to imagine their gentle mother as the broken woman their father had found in that barn, trying to picture their quiet father as the gunfighter who had faced down corrupt officials and hired killers. But as they grew older, they began to understand that heroism doesn't always look like the stories in books. Sometimes it's just the decision to help when help is needed, to stand up when others sit down, to light a candle in the darkness and keep it burning no matter how strong the wind. Samuel stood beside her at Martha's funeral, his hair now silver, his face lined with age, but his eyes still sharp and kind. At 70, he was still the man who had seen a light in the darkness and chosen to investigate. Still the man who believed that doing right was more important than staying safe. Their children had grown and scattered. David became a lawyer like his namesake, fighting for homesteaders' rights in the territorial courts. Their daughter Sarah became a doctor, one of the first women to practice medicine in the territory. Their youngest son, Thomas, chose to stay on the ranch, continuing the tradition of providing sanctuary for those in need. But every year, on the anniversary of the night Samuel had first seen the light in the barn, the family would gather in the garden. They would light candles and tell stories, remembering not just Elizabeth's ordeal, but all the people who had been helped by the Prairie Sisters over the years. And sometimes, when the wind was just right and the candles flickered in the darkness, it seemed as though they could hear the voices of all those who had been saved, women who had escaped abusive husbands, children who had been given homes, men who had been taught that strength came not from domination, but from protection. The barn was long gone, its boards scattered to the four winds or transformed into homes for the needy. But the light that had once flickered so desperately in its darkness had grown into something magnificent, a beacon of hope that continued to shine across the prairie, guiding lost souls to safety and reminding everyone who saw it that even in the darkest places, love could triumph over hate, justice could overcome corruption, and a single act of compassion could change the world. In the end, that was the true legacy of the light in the barn, not just the rescue of one woman, but the transformation of an entire community, the birth of a movement that would outlive all of them, and the proof that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply care enough to look closer, to investigate the strange light in the darkness, and to never, ever give up hope that tomorrow can be better than today. The prairie wind still blows across the land where the barn once stood, but now it carries with it not the whispers of ghosts, but the laughter of children and the promise of tomorrow. For in the end, love conquered hate, justice triumphed over corruption, and the light that had flickered so desperately in the darkness had grown into a beacon that would shine for generations to come. As Samuel and Elizabeth entered their twilight years, they could look back with satisfaction at the world they had helped create. Millfield had become a model community, known throughout the territory for its honest government and progressive attitudes toward women's rights. The Prairie Sisters had evolved into a respected organization with chapters in every state and territory, their work expanding to include education, healthcare, and political advocacy. The garden where the barn had stood became a pilgrimage site of sorts, with people traveling from far and wide to see the place where one woman's courage and one man's compassion had sparked a movement that changed the American frontier forever. A small monument was erected there, bearing the simple inscription, "In memory of all who suffered in darkness, and in honor of those who chose to bring light." And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the endless prairie and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, visitors to the garden could sometimes see a small light flickering among the wildflowers, not the desperate plea for help it had once been, but a gentle reminder that hope endures, love conquers all, and even the smallest light can push back the darkness and illuminate the path to a better tomorrow. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much and come back often.